Chapter 3. June, present day. Avila property, east of Bakersfield, California. Danny Avila watched the smoke cloud rise out of the ruined building. For just a moment, it assumed the aspect of a skull, but he didn't know whether it was a human skull or the new series Terminator cranial housing the engineers were developing. Then the smoke twisted, causing one eye socket to bulge. The skull's mouth widened as though it were straining just before a ferocious bite to come, and Danny's head banged down onto something hard. He opened his eyes and rubbed his forehead. He was face down on the floorboards beside his bed. In his peripheral vision, he could see the shoeboxes, unsorted socks, and dust bunnies that occupied the space beneath his bed. Someone tapped on his bedroom door. "Danielcito?" He stood, still a little sleep-bleary. Morning light poured in through his east-facing window. Above his window and door, and above the bookcases that surrounded his bed, were the only places he could see the room's walls. "Yes, Mama." "Estás bien?" "Are you all right?" The clock on his headboard read 6:58. His dream had cost him 2 minutes of precious sleep. "Yes, Mama, I dropped a book on the floor." "Breakfast is ready." Once upon a time, she never would have switched to English, nor would Danny have answered her in English. While Danny's father Hugo was alive, his rule had been a simple and consistent one: Spanish in the house, English everywhere else. It was a sensible guideline. Hugo hadn't wanted his family to become so anglicized that they lost their mother tongue, or so Spanish-orientated that they suffered in school or business. Danny thought that the rule would probably come back into force if there were ever children in the house again. But Danny and his brothers were grown. There were no children in this house, and Hugo was dead, victim of a heart attack years ago. So his family relaxed the rules a bit. "I'll be right down." He grinned. Mama saying breakfast is ready at this time of day was akin to saying the sun came up a while ago. Unless atomic bombs rained down on Kern County, he'd never need to ask whether breakfast was ready in the Avila house at 7 a.m. He turned to his laptop on his dresser. The first ritual of any morning was to check his email. 10 minutes later, dressed and up to date on email, his laptop in the soft-sided briefcase he habitually carried, he reached the dining room table downstairs. Linda was already at the table, wearing her green and gold Kern County Sheriff's Department uniform. Her blonde hair back in a ponytail, the uniform's green jacket across the back of her chair. A book lay open beside her plate, and she was sufficiently wrapped up in reading it that she did not hear Danny's arrival. Danny leaned over her shoulder to look at it. "Superstrings, huh? That's high-order math. Aren't you too blonde for that?" She glanced up at him, her features set in a mock scowl that couldn't quite mask a grin. She was not a beautiful woman, but had attractive features and intelligent, deep brown eyes. "Well, I'm surprised you recognized the term," she said. "I figured a code geek like you would think superstrings came out of a can." "Oh, you wound me, Deputy. And only breakfast can take away the sting." He took his usual chair opposite her, facing the room's front window with its view of the family's pastures and the highway beyond. "No, really though. Is this for class?" Linda took classes 2 nights a week, working her way, as quickly as her schedule would allow, towards a master's degree in physics. Danny thought it was an unusual choice, figuring a sheriff's deputy seeking higher education would gravitate to law or criminology. But Linda had always said that law enforcement was her job, but not her career. Just some side reading. I have to figure out whether I'm going to invent time travel or faster than light travel first. This will help.
Danny?
Mama called from the kitchen.
You want the usual?
No, Mama. I want what I always have. Here, the usual meant a Hugo Avila breakfast. A plug of cholesterol arranged into scrambled eggs with cheese, fried sausage patties, French toast, and other tasty, heart-stopping choices. It was no use telling Mama that this diet had probably shortened Hugo's life by decades. To her, this was what a breakfast should be. Danny heard his mother's sigh, and he mouthed the words as she spoke them.
Danny, you're too skinny.
Got to stay skinny, Mama. Need to attract a woman someday, and you know it's going to be with my looks, not my personality. You did say something about eventually wanting grandchildren, right? He regretted the words as soon as he had said them. Linda and his brother Alejandro, who went by Alex, had planned to have children someday, and he didn't know whether Linda was sensitive about the subject. But she hadn't reacted at all to his words. Instead, she raised her hands over her head in a stretch to banish the last sleepiness of the morning. Danny managed not to stare. He did love the sight of a woman in uniform. No, it was more than that. He knew that his heart raced every time he came in close contact with Linda. But it wasn't all that good an idea to go lusting after the widow of his own brother. He'd always worried, just a little, that some members of his family didn't fully accept her. A transplanted Texan who had come to California to attend USC, she had an Anglo mother and a Latino father, and there was no language barrier for her in the bilingual household. But she never went to church or allowed herself to be drawn into discussions of faith, and she hadn't become pregnant in the last year she'd been married to Alex. More conservative members of the extended family and their friends wondered if she even considered herself a Christian. Mama came out and set a plate in front of Danny. Scrambled eggs, no cheese, salsa on top, ordinary toast, and a peeled orange. She looked at it disapprovingly. Mama Teresa Avila was the polar opposite of her late husband. She was a small woman, tiny really, whose metabolism and relentless activity level burned through calories at a rate that would make Hollywood starlets sick with envy. Despite her efforts to fatten up everyone remotely related to her, she was lean. At 50, she had yet to get her first grey hair. Her strongest facial feature was a proud and prominent Aztec nose, which Danny, when teasing her, would refer to as her can opener. "This is not enough to keep a hamster alive," she said. "It's fine, Mama." Danny plunged a fork into the eggs, indicating that he was content with such sorry fare. "Besides, you know that programmers can live on diets that would kill lesser men. At work, I sustain myself eating lead paint chips, scorpions, and some very small rocks." She offered him a long-suffering sigh and returned to the kitchen. Linda snickered. "One of these days, she's going to brain you with a ladle." "Papa always said you have to deal with a strong-willed woman by being so much trouble that you break her morale." Alex used to tell me that, when he was being troublesome, of course. She lowered her voice to a conspiratorial level. I wonder if Mama's getting a little deaf. I don't think she can tell the difference between a book and a body hitting the floor. Danny shrugged, swallowing his first mouthful of eggs. I fell out of bed. Bad dream. You were back in high school, naked on a test day. He grinned. I haven't had that dream in days. No, one of the weapon systems I'm working on went haywire, tried to kill a bunch of people, and blew up. His family knew that he programmed weapon systems for the Air Force, but not what sort of systems. No one outside of work knew what he was doing, knew that he was a lead programmer at CRS, working on next-generation Terminator operating systems and Terminator Skynet interface routines. He was on the cutting edge of technology that would someday render the modern infantryman, tank, and helicopter obsolete. But in his dream, an extremely advanced Terminator, a variety that was just now on the drawing boards at CRS, walking on two legs instead of grinding along on tracks, hadn't been serving the interests of its human masters, hadn't been targeting enemy troops or materiel. It had been trying to exterminate Americans in the ruins of an American city. The dream had been unsettling. Linda finished the last of her breakfast and stood. I've got to go. She picked up her plate. From the kitchen, Mama called, Just leave it, dear. I'll get it. Danny shot Linda an accusing look. She's not going deaf, he whispered. Linda grinned. Don't you just love a peace officer who lies to you? The gravel driveway leading off the Avila property was 1 lane wide, and the gravel hadn't recently been replenished. The track was now 2 shallow earthen ruts, with gravel between them and to either side. Danny stopped his car, a late model Jeep Grand Cherokee in sunlight reflecting white, just before the driveway reached Highway 58, and looked back across the property. In the foreground were acres and acres of pasturage, slightly rolling land with patches of hardy grasses and scrub bushes throughout. Spotted cattle, not yet enervated by early summer sun, slowly moved from patch to patch. In the middle distance rose the family home, a wide 2-story wooden farmhouse built in the 1930s and carefully maintained in the decades since. It gleamed yellow with white trim in the morning sunlight. To the left of it was a low single-story bunkhouse built much more recently, and nearby were the barn, pump house, and other auxiliary buildings of working farms. Further out were groves of oranges and pistachios. 10 years ago, when the bunkhouse was first built, the property looked almost the same from this perspective, but it was actually much larger. Then, Hugo Avila was finally facing the reality that none of his 3 sons was going to follow in their father's profession. Lon, the oldest at 22, had just graduated from business school and seemed destined for a successful career with the San Francisco brokerage that had hired him. Alex, the 21-year-old middle son, was in his junior year of college and was adamant about following the career path of an uncle in law enforcement. Danny, the youngest at 16, had been accepted for admission to UCLA, and his academic successes so far, plus his obvious genius with computer programming, made his father tremendously proud of him. But that left the Avilas without a farmer in the new generation, and Hugo, no tradition-bound fool, did not even try to lure his sons back to his way of life. Instead, with an unspoken regret, he began selling or leasing the more distant fields and pastures to surrounding farms and ranches. He built a small bunkhouse and hired seasonal workers for the peak work times of the year. The rest of the work he did himself, sometimes joined by sons home on weekends. Even today, in spite of its reduced circumstances, the property was still profitable, and still theirs. Hugo Avila was 5 years in his grave, but his common-sense preparations had ensured that the family still had a home to return to, regardless of how broadly scattered they might be from time to time. There was an unspoken agreement between Danny and Lon that, whatever happened, the farm would remain in Avila hands. Danny put the Jeep into gear and turned east, rightward onto 58, the highway that took him every workday to Edwards Air Force Base. Edwards AFB, in addition to being a working US Air Force base and an alternate landing site for the space shuttle, housed many public and not-so-public operations. NASA's Dryden Flight Research Center, the Air Force Research Laboratory, and the Chief Research and Development Facility of Cyber Research Systems Autonomous Weapons Division. Edwards, a part of the tabloid notorious Area 51 Testing Center, conceivably housed many more projects even more secretive than CRS. Danny didn't know and didn't care. Much of the CRS Autonomous Weapons Division lay underground. Machine fabrication areas, testing ranges, communication centers, generators, access to the complex's very own particle accelerator. But at the surface, it looked like nothing more than a nicely modern glass and metal office building 3 stories tall. A spy satellite trained on the site would see Danny drive into the Edwards complex through the north gate, navigate his Jeep almost to the complex's south end to the CRS building, and enter his workplace, just as thousands of civilian employees of the military did it at scores of bases across the United States and its possessions. But as he took the elevator down to the first basement level, which served as home base for the project's programmers, he could reflect, with satisfaction and an edge of worry, that this base was as secret, mysterious, and potentially unbalancing of the world's balance of power as the first atomic missile bases had been 50-odd years ago. He walked into Cube Hell and took in the usual quiet chaos of clicking keys, muffled curses, and conversation. On the far side of the room, something tiny and glinting, a paperclip launched from a rubber band, shot up from one cubicle to strike the acoustic tile of the ceiling and ricochet down into the adjacent cubicle, followed by an unrestrained cry of, "You bastard!" Danny grinned. It was his second home. Then, from the vicinity of Danny's own double-wide, double-deep cubicle, Dr. Sherman stood up, and Danny's heart sank. Phil Sherman was, in theory, lead programmer on the next-generation Terminator project. Like Danny, he was lean and above average height, but he lacked Danny's broad shoulders. His green eyes behind old-fashioned gold-rimmed glasses, his hair graying, dressed in a conservative grey suit, Sherman looked like he could be a banker by day and a friendly grandfather by night, though he had been a programmer and developer on several of the Apollo moonshots and many NASA and military projects since. His skills hadn't kept up with modern programming languages and tools, but he was unusually adept at finding, hiring, and managing the most talented of today's generation of code wranglers. But his presence at Danny's cubicle at the start of work usually meant something had gone wrong. Sherman's office was several stories up, on the same level as the computer center and General Brewster's office. Danny hurried over. What's wrong, Phil? Sherman smiled. Diplomatic relations breaking down between the military and civilian side of things, as usual. General Brewster's going to perform a demonstration with Scowl at noon today, and Scowl's not feeling cooperative. Danny moved into his cubicle and sat in front of his computer. He powered up its monitor and logged in. Scowl, a prototype Terminator, was the testbed for new operating system innovations and engineering improvements. It had all the functionality of the first generation T1s, which had been secretly deployed to sites across the United States, but was much smaller. T1s were nearly the size of mid-size cars, while Scowl could be packed into a civilian van with room to spare. T1s had arms that ended in tank-busting chain guns, while Scowl's arms were fitted with articulated metal hands, and the robot's programming allowed it to operate every small arm, every man-portable missile system in the US military arsenal, in theory at least. Scowl was the Terminator onto which he and his team loaded each new update to the operating system, each program patch with a new feature. What's wrong with it? It's trying to fly. Sherman sat in Danny's guest chair. We've got some footage on the problem. Look in the bug list directory for a file named Flapper. Brewster's going to kill us. The whispered comment came from above Sherman's head. Danny turned to look. Jerry Squires, another team programmer, was standing in his adjacent cubicle, resting his chin on the partition in between. The effect was that of a narrow, diabolic-looking severed head, with tousled sandy hair having been balanced there. Danny turned back to his monitor. He found the file in question and double-clicked on it to launch the recording. You ever been in Brewster's office, Jer? Squires continued his spectral whisper voice. No. You know what's on his desk? Again, I say, no. A picture of his daughter. And his daughter's kind of hot. I say General's got a hot daughter, you strive to make him happy every day of the year. Against the time he's so happy with you, he invites you home for Thanksgiving. Danny's monitor resolved itself to a view, from low ceiling height, of Scowl. The squat tracked robot was situated before a folding table. On the table were several objects. A chess set whose pieces' location suggested that a game was well underway, a glass half full of clear liquid, and a handgun Danny recognized as an M9 Beretta, the Armed Forces standard issue 9mm semi-automatic. Manual dexterity tests? That's right, Sherman said. Plus a test of the interface between Scowl, the mainframe control, and a commercial chess program. Jer got it all functioning last night, but not exactly successfully. The severed head, no longer whispering, said, Hey! The word was a complaint. On the screen, the Terminator began to reach for the chessboard. But before its arm had moved more than a few inches, it folded the arm up at the elbow and tucked it in place tightly against its body, raised and lowered it, and did it again. Only then did it reach out to grasp one of the knights on the chessboard. With slow deliberation, it lifted the piece and set it down to endanger a white bishop. The tucking and flapping looked curiously like a bird with a damaged wing trying to lift off. Danny snickered. How often does it do that? Every time it's called on to use either arm, Sherman said. The only arm-related task that doesn't set it off is a diagnostics check. Think you can fix it before noon? Danny turned an incredulous expression on him. What, based on what I've seen here, without even digging into the code? Yes. Danny relented. Well, I think I can fix it in 10 or 20 minutes. Oh, bullshit, Jur objected. I've been here all night working on it. I haven't even been home. Well, that explains the smell. Well, anyway, I can't figure it out. I can. Danny pointed a finger accusingly at him. Let me guess. You were fiddling with the fine manipulation code last night to keep Scowl from knocking down as many chess pieces as usual, and at some point you cut and pasted in some of the self-checking stuff I did yesterday for its setup for transport mode. Well, yeah, how'd you know? The code you borrowed is structured like some of the standard problem-solving routines. It calls subroutines that figure out all the motion control steps for the task it's been presented. But since I wrote it specifically for machine shutdown, the task is automatically assumed to be fold up for transport. So there are a couple of places where, instead of looking for the register that defines its current task, it automatically assumes shutdown procedures have begun, and it folds up its arm to lock into place. Instead of going, move chess piece, it's going, shut down, move chess piece. The severed head winced. Well, that's your fault. You were sloppy. I wrote it from scratch. You borrowed it, and you did a lousy job of filing off the serial numbers. So who's sloppy? You are. Sherman rose, a tolerant smile on his face. Gentlemen, I'll send over some nerve pistols so you can duel it out at dawn. In the meantime, Danny, I'd appreciate it if you'd get this straightened out so the general doesn't pop his cork. I'll do that. And I'll tell him you think his daughter's kind of hot. Oh, don't do that. With Sherman gone, Jur stared down at him. Well, your mistake was in saying kind of hot. 2 mistakes for the price of 1. You're suggesting that you could bag his little girl, but also that she's not the most baggable little girl in the whole world. Go home, code thief. Danny turned his back to his monitor. The footage of the Terminator's chicken wing antics was certainly amusing. Someday, he hoped, the early stages of the Terminator project would be declassified, so the footage could show up on a blooper reel or as an internet download.